I'm expecting quite a lot of people coming into this one. So what I'll do is I'll just put up my slides, but while I do so, it would be useful if you all were able to perhaps use a chat function to introduce yourself, and also and where you are from, and also if you have got are there any specific questions or any specific aspects that you would like to talk about or explore today? That would be really useful thing to do. Is that okay? So there is a new feature in this one. We can use that one. So there's a whiteboard. I've not used this one before. So why don't you introduce yourself into the chat box and perhaps write your questions or your expectations, or what is any specific things that you want to learn from this session onto the whiteboard. So I think you will have to click on this small little no. If I just write something, let me see how to do it. So yes, if you click this small, can you see my screen, everyone? So this small little T, which is for the text, if you click on that, and I think you can write whatever you like here. Okay. Sarah has also joined me from Doncaster and Basildon Teaching Hospital, so she will be helping me with the session, and I will let Sarah introduce herself as well. And I think this will also help you to see if there are any specific questions that you may have from Sarah, and she can help you with. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Parveen. Yeah, I'm Sarah Gardner. I'm the Clinical Outreach Librarian at Doncaster and Bassett Law Trust. And Parveen and I have planned these sessions of writing for publication topics. So I'll be putting various bits into chat in a little while, including our supporting research website, and also an evaluation towards the end of the session. If you wouldn't mind filling that in, that would be most helpful. It will help us kind of adapt our sessions going forward to what you need. So if there are anything evidence-y, library-like for Doncaster and Bassett Law staff, then you know to contact me. And if you have queries, pop them in the chat and I will do my best to address them.
Yeah, and please do suggest where you are from, so we know where the audience are from. It doesn't matter where where you are from. It's just that it will help us capture that information, and also if you have any questions, it will just help us to see what is it that people find useful. Okay. Okay. All right, how many papers are accepted from the qualitative thesis? 1 per chapter. Scared of salami slicing? Okay, fine. All right, okay, so let's have a look at the chat as well. Okay, while you're introducing yourself, it will also be useful if you just say a little bit about like who you are and what your profession is. What it will do is that it will help me understand to pitch the session. I don't want to just use examples from nursing or a particular field, and if there are people who are in the audience who are not that, so just please do make sure that if you could just say a few words about yourself, I think that will just make it easier for me. Okay, excellent. So this thing has worked. Has anyone who has had a problem with the writing on the whiteboard? I've used it for the first time, so I've never used it before. Anyone else wants to write anything on here? Or just put that into the chat box if it's a little bit too much for you. And I'm just going to stop sharing it and put my slides on. And I don't know how to stop sharing this. Close whiteboard. Yes, there we go. Okay, so can you see my slides now?
Yep, looking good.
Okay, so let me put that into the. Okay, slideshow mode. All right, okay. Fine. So there are quite a few questions about various different aspects related to publishing. So what I will do is I'll go through initial information about how do you convert your thesis into a journal article, and then what we could. Okay, I'm just looking at the messages if there's anything which I've missed. Fine. And then we can have question answers to see if there's anything that people would like to discuss, ask more, etc. Okay. So I will, please, could you keep yourself mute? And if you have got any questions in between while I'm talking, so you can keep on writing onto the chat box, or can ask later on, and we can just take it on from there. Sarah, would you be happy to keep an eye on the gate, basically, to see who's coming in, if that's okay?
Yes, that's fine. Am I co-hosting so I can let them through?
I think so. Do you want to check that just to make sure? No, you're not. You were earlier. I think you did.
Yeah, I had to go out and come back in. I didn't have camera.
Okay, so now you are.
Lovely.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. So when it comes to converting a thesis into a journal article, there are many people would like to do that, but I think usually there are some mistakes which people make. They just think that you can just copy from one thing to the other. And then once they submit something, they struggle in terms of finding into the right kind of structures. The length is too long, and there are other issues which happens. And as a result, they really find it hard how to do it. And if they have done it and managed to submit into a journal, it usually doesn't get accepted. And then that has, a couple more times, if that is not accepted by various journals, it's quite demotivating, and then people stop publishing it. And so this kind of a vicious circle. So that's what we're going to look at that. So first of all, we need to understand why is it that we need to convert thesis into a journal article. So I've written two things here. One is that you want to share the findings to various audience, because when you're writing your thesis, this is for a very limited audience. It's only usually about yourself and the lecturer or the professor that has been supporting you, your class teacher, and they usually see it. Or if it is like a thesis where you've done a PhD research, it's your committee members who have looked at it, and it's your supervisors who have looked at it, and it's then your examiner who have looked at it. So you want to then use those findings to share to wider audience, and that's why you would like to publish your thesis. And it may be that you wanted to use that aspect, that opportunity to learn more about it, to see how to write for publication, and that usually helps people. Is there anything else? Are there any other purposes that any one of you would like to say, that why would you want to write for or convert a thesis into a journal article? Anyone? If you would like to say something, just raise your hand and we'll be able to ask you to interact, or you can just write into the chat box as well. Okay. All right. Okay. So there are differences between a thesis and a journal article, and that's why straight copy and paste mechanism don't work. Now, what are those differences? As I said, thesis usually is written for different audience. That's the biggest difference. There are a journal article are much bigger audience that you write it for. What other differences are there? Tell me characteristics of the thesis. Come on. Word count. Sarah has started. No, we don't feel like talking this morning, do we? Okay. Divided into chapters, writing style is different. There are too many headings. Okay. So if we start off like the requirement, because thesis is usually written for meeting academic requirements of an academic degree. So therefore, the requirement could be very different for, if it could be written for a graduate degree, it is written for master's degree, and it is written for PhD degree. And depending on which degree it is written for, the content analysis and the depth could be very, very different. Okay. There are certain requirements that you need to meet. So they would have given you levels at what is it that they're expecting you to write and how much or what it is written. So that usually is there. These are reviewed by selected people, as we talked about earlier on. So it fits, for example, undergraduate or master's dissertation, it may be just yourself, your supervisor who is reading it, or examiner, or sometimes when it goes to external examiner, those people or those who are moderating it. If these are PhD theses, again, your individual examiners, your committee members, when you're presenting in front of the public, maybe a little bit of those people, and then it's just there into the library for anybody else to see it. It has got a structure. There are various chapters into a thesis, and you write according to those chapters. It usually is very lengthy. Your word limit is very generous. So if you're writing a undergraduate dissertation, it will be about 6,000 to 7,000 words, something like that. Anything between 5,000 to 7,000. If you're writing for masters, it's usually is about 10 to 12,000, sometimes up to 15,000. If you're writing for a PhD, it could be up to 100,000 words or sometimes a little bit more than that. So the word limit is usually very, very generous. You start off with a table of content. There are sections of acknowledgement. There are, there is a structure that you use. You provide a lot of information about why you are interested into the research topic, and they introduce the topic in quite detail. There's very lengthy research, literature reviews presented and explained why this topic is important, what is the available research saying about that particular aspect, and anything else that you know about the topic. There is quite detailed description of everything that you have done within the thesis. So basically, theses are written as an evidence of your learning as to what have you learned by going through the process. So you not only talk about the process that you have used when doing your research. So you're reporting, this is the research, that's why I did it, but you justify why you did what you did. So there's a lot of justification. There's a lot of details that you have provided. There's a lot of detailed description of the ethical approval procedures if it's in one country. If it's in more than one country, again, you may want to talk about both of those countries. So there's a lot of detailed description of everything that you have done to enable your examiners and your teachers and people who are reviewing it to see what have you learned, how you did it, why you did it, and do you actually understand the whole purpose of research. So it's basically, because it's research training, so here you're demonstrating how you've trained. As I talked about, description of the process is quite a lot. You also provide a lot of description about the tools or the instruments that you use for data collection or data analysis. And again, you provide a lot of that information to demonstrate that you understand why you chose the tools that you choose, how you use them, and what was the implications of them, how you analyze them, and all of that. Usually, there are main findings which relate to your main research topic, but then there are quite a lot of associated findings that you come across when you're doing research. And when it comes to thesis writing, you present all of that information. Most of the information is presented to describe all of that. And verb tense, depending on kind of which chapter you're writing, could be very different. So you're using a different language and it's written for different audience. Is that clear to everyone? Okay, so let's talk about now journal article. Journal article you write for different journals. Very specific journals would have very specific standards. So for instance, BMC Public Health would be interested in articles which are related to public health. International Nursing Review, for instance, is interested in articles which are related to nurses and nursing profession. Journal of Interpersonal Violence is interested in articles which are related to any issues related to gender-based abuse or interpersonal violence. So, and if you look at various journals criteria, all of them would have very different criteria, starting from the word count, the structure, how they want you to write an article, the focus, and the main difference usually is audience. Your thesis, generally, you know who is going to review it, but your journal articles, you don't know who you're writing it for. Well, I guess you know who you're writing it for, but you don't know who is reviewing it. So first of all, you're writing it for the editor, because as an editor, if I don't find your article interesting, your manuscript interesting, I'm just going to put that into the bin or say, well, I'm really sorry, I am not interested in that. So you want to catch the attention of the editor, then you want to catch the attention of the reviewers, and then you want to write it for the audience later on. So there are different checkpoints that you have to go through. Reviewers usually don't know who you are, so most journal articles still go through the blind reviewer system, which means that the reviewers don't know who the authors are and authors don't know who the reviewers are. Okay, which then means that they are able to look at the science and what you have written, and then to be able to assess that effectively and provide you with effective feedback, or make a judgment as to what, if they want that article to be accepted or rejected or changed. Journal articles usually have different sections, and you would have seen it's usually the sections include abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. There could be small subsections between introduction and method section, and it's usually similar sort of stuff which is presented. So for instance, in method section, you talk about participant, you talk about your study setting, you talk about your data collection, data analysis activities, and all of those sections are quite brief as compared to thesis. So when thesis, you may have kind of a full page written up about the setting. Here you probably only would have 3 or 4 sentences that you're going to write. Word limit is very different. So anything between 5,000, so Journal of Advanced Nursing, for instance, if you are going to apply for that one, you probably would only have about 5,000 word limits. Then Social Sciences of Medicine, for instance, they probably have about 8,000 word limit. If you're going for Journal of Aggression and Violence, they probably have 30 pages word limit, which turns out to be around 8,000 words, etc. So there are variation in word limit depending on which journal do you go for, but it's limited, much more limited than a thesis. Manuscript format, they require you to write in a specific format. The literature review that you present or the research that you present around, that's usually very succinct and very, very brief, but to the point, but at the same time giving a lot of information about what the findings or implications are from the literature. Ethical issues process, you had in your thesis, you were going to have a detailed description of ethics and how you've done it. Whereas here you probably only have about 1 to 3 or 4 sentences to describe ethical issues or processes that you have used when doing your research. You do provide information about the tools and instruments that you're using, but again, it has to be very, very succinct and very, very short description. Again, as we said that in thesis, you talk about all the findings that you have gathered. Here, you only provide selected findings which are related to one particular research question and not everything. Okay, so and verb tenses are fairly consistent. So you usually write in past tense most of the time throughout of that, sometimes present tense, but whatever tense you use, you're usually consistently using it throughout the article. So that's the differences between thesis and journal articles. So you could actually see that why copy and pasting from one thing to the other is not going to work. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? No? All right. Okay. Okay, so fine. So this was the differences between these two things. We talked about why we need to do it now, but the trouble usually is, how do we do it? What is the first step that we do? So start off with identifying the best journal for your work. Okay, so look at the topic, look at the issue that you have written, and then look at the available journals within the research field. So for instance, if you are, I'm just looking at here, is there anyone who is, most people here are, if you're a healthcare professional, you would probably be looking at a healthcare related journal. Okay, if you are, if your research was about nursing or any particular aspect, uh, you would be looking for around those sorts of things. So I think knowing what identifying journal depends on what your field is, and even more than that, what the topic of your research is. Previously, a few years back, or maybe about 10-15 years back, what used to happen that you would have, for example, journals, which is, for example, Journal of Advanced Nursing, BMC Public Health, postgraduate medical education, something. So people used to name journals because different people used to subscribe to those journals, and they used to have hard copies of the journals sent to them, which then means that not everybody was able to sign up or buy every journal. And therefore, the scope of what you're going to publish in a West Journal was limited, and people usually would publish the findings for the profession or for the discipline which they were interested in. Now that is not the case. So if you have got something related to public health, for instance, and you think that thing would probably be of interest to all those people who are working in health services, so you might want to choose Health Service Research Journal, because it doesn't really matter which journal they've published in. So what matters is that what is the topic of your research, what is it that you want to share it with the audience, and which journal do you think is best placed to share that information to people you are interested in. So all you need to do is to ensure that the research that the journal that you identify is appropriate for the topic that you have. They have published that kind of topic previously in the same journal, and they have got kind of a track record into it. So for instance, if you wanted to write a clinical article, you're better off sending it to a clinical journal rather than a generic journal. If your article is related to education, you are better off looking at a journal which the scope of which is looking at educational practices and not practice related aspect. If you wanted to publish an article which is more on a sort of research methods, you're better off looking at a journal which has got the specific type of aims and objectives and publish it there. So now you might be thinking that I earlier said that it's not necessary that you publish, identify one particular journal, but now I'm saying that identify a specific journal. But these are two different things. What I said earlier on, that you don't need to be discipline specific. So it doesn't need to be that you only identify journals that are specific to your discipline or profession. But now what I'm saying is it has to be relevant with the topic that you, or the concept that you're presenting to that. So identify various journals. How do you do that? Once you were doing your literature search, or when you were writing for your thesis, you must have come across and used quite a lot of literature. So look at those articles, where were those published, the relevant articles, and check which journals they're published from. So that gives you an idea, so that you can make a list of potential journal. You can also have a look at the website with specific topics, and that usually helps. But I think by far the most easiest method is that when you're using literature, you are familiar with it, so you can see various different names of the journal where those articles are published, and that just helps you quite a lot when going through. Check who is your audience, who are you writing it for, and make sure that the journal captures those audience. Check the aims and scope of the journal. Read through. So for any journal, if you go onto the top menu, the top page into on their website, look for the page which gives journal information. and aims and objectives and scope of the journal. So read through that information to see if that suits you or not. The other thing that you need to look into it, that what kind of articles the journal publishes. Now, there are certain journals which only publish, for example, reviews, systematic reviews, or any kind of, there are journals which only publish research related articles and don't publish any systematic reviews or narrative reviews or anything like that. So reading through aims and scope of the journal would allow you to see that information, and you're not going to waste time. A lot of the time, what we see is that people submitted abstract to wrong journals, which then means that you've gone through the lengthy process of selecting the journal, doing all of that you need to do, submitted it, and 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the line, you get a rejection email saying that your article or your manuscript doesn't relate to the aims and scope of our journal, and therefore we can't do it. So it's always worth spending a little bit of time beforehand rather than wasting time like that. So always make sure that you identify different journals, make a list of 5 or 10 journals that you have, look at these questions that I've just talked to you about, what your topic is, it's clinical or not, who the audience are, what kind of journals publish, and then look at the journal reputation, which could be impact factor and other thing. Now, impact factor is something which confuses quite a lot of people, and people usually want to go for high impact factor journals. It's not really kind of a requirement or necessary to publish in a high impact factor journal. However, because the higher impact factor journals are those where publishing is usually difficult, because the number of manuscripts that they get is very high, so they can reject quite a lot of manuscript quite easily, and only quality manuscript go into it, the amount and work which is published in there. So eventually the quality of the article published is much better, which then means that how it is rated later on is much better too. So that's why the impact factor becomes a proxy sort of measure to see the quality of a journal. But it also gives you, you can also try and kind of have a look at the aspect that, if you are a novice writer, you're writing it for the first time, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is that, yes, make a list of 2 or 3 journals with high impact factor, then choice number 2, then choice number 3. And you already know that if you're going to submit to the very high impact factor journal, you're going to get rejected. So you know that most of the time. But the reason you should submit to that journal, that if you pass through the stages of peer review, if you get accepted into that journal, wow, that is great. You've got you won the jackpot. If you don't, at least somebody is going to give you very good feedback, which you can then use to improve the quality of the manuscript that you have and submit to another journal. Okay, so that's the way. Then, if you go to the second and third in your list, you will be able to get that published. So that's one way of doing it. But if you're not very confident, and if you kind of just think that it's not close enough to that particular journal, then perhaps if you're new to writing, I would suggest start off with journals which are magazine oriented journals, which are not that strict, but at the same time provide you with lots of support. So for instance, for nurses and midwives, if you are in the UK, so you could choose something like Nursing Standard, Nursing Times, and some of those, British Journal of Nursing, that kind of journal. They're not easy to publish with, but they're not as difficult and as hard as the other academic journals. The other thing is that support that you get in these journals is quite extensive, so you'll be able to build your ability to write better by writing for them. If you're still struggling and you don't know what kind of thing or journal you should go for, there are mechanisms which you can use to find a better journal. So there is this thing called Use Journal Finder. Different publishers have provided that kind of facility. So if you go for the BMC related journal, they have this one. Elsevier related journal have also this facility. Wiley related journal also have that facility. And all you need to do is enter usually they ask for your title of your manuscript, keywords, and they can suggest, or sometimes they ask you to add the abstract into the window, and they can tell you which journal would be the best suitable for you. It doesn't guarantee publishing in that particular journal, but it just gives you some suggestion to use that particular journal for yourself. Any questions so far? No. Okay. The next thing is then read the instructions. So once you've identified 2 or 3 journal or 1 journal, whatever that is, I suggest choose 2 or 3 journals, then read the instruction of all of those journals. The idea here is that you want to make sure that all those 2 or 3 journals are similar in terms of their requirement. So for instance, you want to make sure that all of them in terms of referencing are asking for Harvard or APA referencing, which then means that if you have written an article for one particular journal, and if it gets rejected, when you're submitting it to the other journal, you won't have to go through changing all the references that you used earlier on. You are also looking for journals which require similar length of the article so that you don't have to chop it down. If you have to chop it down, I think, and you've got 2 or 3 journals, and I think write for the first time for the journals which gives you bigger word count. The reason for this is that it's always easier to edit and reduce the word count than it is to build up the word count. So try and prioritize your journals like that. But anyway, whatever 2 or 3 journals you've chosen, and whatever first journal that you're going to submit, make sure that you have looked at the author's guidelines. You're looking at the what do they publish, what sort of structure they're looking for, what kind of headings they're asking for, because certain journal ask for bullet points related to this, related to that. There are specific requirements, so you are looking at all of those sorts of aspects. It may also be useful to try and read a recently published article in that particular journal and try and use that article, try and find an article which is related to your field. The reason for this is that it will make much more sense to you. It may also give you indication as to, is there any other literature that you should be citing? It gives you an idea of how they have developed their sections, different sections, and how you can write that. Now, when we say this to people, we don't want you to copy and paste. It's not about that, if somebody has written an article on the field that you are writing it, so you just copy and paste information how they've written. No, the idea is to look at the structure, to look at the content, how they've written, so that it makes it easier for you to write your manuscript according to that guidelines. The idea is not to copy and paste from other particular articles. And have a plan B, which I've already said that, once you've got 1, 2, 3 journals, which means that if you get rejected from one particular journal, what is the plan B? Where are you going to send it to next time? So you already know that. If you get rejected from there, where are you going to send it next? So that just helps you reduce your time that you've spent. Otherwise, you will have to go through the whole cycle all over again. The other thing that you should also be doing, which I've not written here, is to try and use reference managers if you can. And the usefulness of that is that if you have to pick from one journal and submit to something else, it will at least, you will waste less time in changing the reference style and writing it differently. Okay, next step is to shorten the length of your thesis. How do you do that? Develop an outline. So your thesis is about, minimum it will be about 12,000, 15,000 words. You can't publish all of that in that chatty language into a journal article. So try and see what is the main message that you want to give to people. Simply copying pasting is not working. So you're going to make an outline that this is my research question that I'm going to convey into the journal article, and you have to write it that way. So developing an outline would help you do that, and you will know which sections you're going to use into the journal article. Always realize that your thesis is a different document. It's not the same document. It's written for different audience, and it is a separate piece of work. It's not, you can't just copy and paste from one thing to the other. You also need to look at that, some paraphrasing may be needed from one thing to the other, but make sure that you're not distorting the meaning of what you're saying, but you're trying to convey the same information into less word. Okay, select and repurpose part of your thesis. So once you've got, usually journal articles has got introduction, methods, results, and discussion and other chapters. While I'm saying that simply copying pasting is not working, you may want to kind of say, okay, fine, this is the introduction, I'm going to work from this one, but you have to reword and reconvert for each of the sessions that you're going to write. You may want to put it that, but it will have to be rewritten. It may be useful to write an abstract. Sometimes most theses that you're writing would have an abstract, so maybe that could be a starting point. If you haven't had an abstract as part of your thesis, you may want to look at the introduction and discussion section to then develop a succinct abstract. Now, again, what it is going to do, that you're forced to write the information within 200 or 300 words, and you will only look for the specific aspects that you're writing. What it will help you do is you will know what's the message that needs to be conveyed through the article and what's the message that needs to be conveyed in various sections of the journal article. Okay. So if you have got an abstract, or if you haven't got an abstract, you've got introduction and discussion, try and kind of, write 100, 150 words or 200 words to say what your key findings were and what is it that you're going to say to people. Then looking at the introduction and research aims and objectives. In thesis, you usually have more than one aim, or you have one overarching aim, but 2 or 3 research questions, or 2 or 3 objectives of the specific research that you're doing. Here you're trying to see if your research questions are similar enough or different enough. Do you need to combine them? Do you need to write them into different journal articles? Do you need to, how is it that you're going to make sure that you can write more than one article if you need to, but you want to make sure that it's not copied, or if it's not saying the same thing. So the idea of salami slicing, somebody was asking earlier on. So that's where you're going to look at the research objectives and research question, either merge them or change them completely, depending on what your thing is. So qualitative thesis, for example, usually have quite a lot of findings, and it's really difficult to publish the findings from qualitative thesis into one journal article, which only give you about 7,000 or 8,000 words. So it may be necessary that you want to present the findings in more than one article, but here you're going to have a look at that, how can you do this sensibly, and how can you make sure that you're presenting different findings into the different journal articles, but at the same time not losing the commonalities between them, but it's not simply copy and paste. Remember that when you submit a journal article to any particular journal, the first step usually editorial assistant does is it goes through the authenticate, something which is like Turnitin. So it's that kind of software where they check for similarity. And if the article that you've submitted is very similar to another published article by yourself or by somebody else, it's going to be rejected. So therefore, try and make sure that you've clearly thought through at this point that which objectives you're going to focus on and how you're going to talk about those particular aspects. Okay. And I'm trying to see, what did I say? Check. So usually, I normally suggest that once you've identified and done these things, it's a lot easier if you wrote methods and findings section first. So you've written your thesis, you look at the methods section and you look at the findings section and try and reduce both of them and write your methods section for your journal article and write your findings section for your journal article. These are the most easiest one, because here when you're doing this, you can see what is it that you need to take out, what is it that you're going to retain. And if you've already read previous article published in that journal, you will know how much information they're asking you in that place. Same goes with the findings section. In the findings section again, in method section, so you don't give the reams and reams of every detail that you've used to write your study. So succinctly describe your setting, your sample, participant, everything else. And the same if it's a qualitative findings, you don't have to give quote after quote, but you don't just depend on just one quote without describing context. So it is how you're presenting that information which is appropriate enough and not too much for the reader to read and still make sense. In thesis, you probably have a lot of tables and a lot of figures dotted around at various different places. When you're writing your journal article, you also have to see how many tables and figures you need to add, and you may need to merge them together or choose the specific ones that you are going to put that into the result section to highlight the findings there. So that's some work that you need to do, but usually that's an easier work to do. So I've talked about the findings section, that you need to shorten the length, but make sure that you don't distort the meaning. You may have to combine tables and figures, check the requirement as to how many tables and figures you're allowed, and same with quotations and everything else. Then you need to write discussion and introduction section afterwards. Now, why these two are together? Because to write the discussion section, you will have to go back to the literature to find appropriate evidence to support or negate the findings that you have presented. And that's the best time when you can also write introduction. So these two things are going to be much easier if you've done your methods and findings first, and then you're writing introduction and discussion. So it will everything would flow together. Make sure that you will already have your introduction and discussion section. So you want to use some of that concept, but you cannot just simply copy and paste. So you will have to make sure that it is written for the audience that you're writing it for. And it is clear and it's concise and it is in the style of the journal that you are submitting for. Okay. Okay, so that was the hard part. And now usually what people do is that once they have written this, they just think, oh, well, I'm done and I can submit. No, actually you can't. So this is only the first part that you've written. You've converted information from your thesis into the journal article. Now leave it on one side and take a break. Okay. The reason for this is that if you're constantly engaging with the journal, with any piece of writing, you wouldn't be able to see anything wrong with it. Everything would make sense. Even if there are grammatical mistakes or the language mistake or something else, you will not be able to pick that up. Whereas if you have taken some break and you have left that aside for 2 days, 3 days, a week or so, and when you go back to it and read it again, you would just be able to pick up the aspects that you haven't picked up earlier on. So here, you've written it once, but then it's edit, 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 and proofread. So you have to edit more than once. You have to go through from the start till the end to make sure that it all flows together. The language is right, it's written well. And once you're happy with it, then you need to make sure that you proofread it and make sure that there are no sort of mistakes which are affecting the quality of the journal article. It may be useful to give it to somebody who is not been involved in writing, or who sometimes probably doesn't even know the topic that you're writing it for them to read and to give you some feedback, because what they can pick up, you will not be able to pick up and make changes. Here a related point is that always reader is always right. So if somebody is reading an article or manuscript or anything that you have written, and if they are telling you it's not making sense, it's not making sense, full stop. There are no ifs and buts, or I had this in my mind and this is how I wrote it, and I wrote it because of this reason and that reason. No. If someone is saying it's not clear to them, it's not clear to them. Your reader cannot look into your brain to get the contextual information that you already have in your brain. They're going to read that particular article that you've submitted, and that includes editor, peer reviewers, and finally your audience. So they need to make sense from that particular piece, and that piece needs to be able to stand for itself. So if someone is telling you it's not clear, it means it's not clear. So therefore, it may be useful to give it to a couple of people so that you get kind of a better idea if there's anything that needs to be done. Discussion must be clear and concise. You may need to look at the number of references, because some journals would stipulate the number of references that you can have into it, etc. And then once you've done all of that, then again go through the author's guidelines and your manuscript again. So go through the journal author guidelines, read through your manuscript again to make sure that you are meeting all the guidelines, all the requirements that journals are asking you for in terms of references, in terms of tables, in terms of figures and everything else, to avoid you from the point of that you've submitted something and 2 days or 1 week later, an email comes back and say, we've unsubmitted your manuscript because you didn't do this, this, and this. It may still happen, but if you have used these kind of measures, the likelihood of this happening would be much less than before. Okay. And once you've done all of that, you're ready to submit. That's it. So that's how you convert your thesis into journal article. And I'm happy to take any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my slide. And so here is my detail if you wanted to write to me or if you wanted to follow me on Twitter to ask any questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. So I'll stop sharing and then I can take questions and we can have a discussion. Okay, any questions? What I would say, if you could just raise your hand and then so that we don't talk over each other, and then we can take questions. And in the meantime, I'll have a look at the chat function to see if there's anything that anyone written there. Okay, so pardon me because I may pronounce your name wrong, but is it Geroid? Say something. Hang on. Yeah, I think you can use your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's Garode, as in get off the road, Garode.
All right, okay. So apologies about that.
Not at all, don't worry, it's the story of my life. You can imagine living in Scotland what it's like. So my question is it okay in the, because mine is a really big qualitative thesis and was very social science theoretically driven, even though it was nursing. Is it okay to acknowledge within the manuscript that you're kind of saying, look, the findings of this article that I'm publishing are findings, but there is a much wider kind of context for the thesis. So what I'm actually showing you is actually maybe only one or two of actually a chapter when there might have been, you know, multiple findings in a chapter. Is that kind of, would you recommend doing that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. What approach are you using?
Like I did a qualitative study and I used Braun and Clark's thematic analysis.
Thematic analysis. Okay. Yeah. So now what you can do is, like, you may have themes which are, it depends what your kind of overall result is, and you may have themes which are related to each other, but you may have themes which are presenting completely different sort of aspect, and they can kind of stand alone by themselves, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it is like if you take the example of human body. So human body is one thing, but it may be that there is one article which is just talking about arm. And what is that arm and how that is working. And it's okay to say that the findings of this particular presented in this particular manuscript are taken from a wider piece of research which talks about this and that. And you can actually self-cite or, you know, cite the other journal articles that you've published from there, or your thesis as well. So that's fine, as long as there is not a lot of copy pasting, because if you don't do that, and if the editor picks up on the similarity at different places, you will get rejected. So you're better off saying that, you know, this is a wider piece of research, and this article is going to present X, and there is another article which perhaps is presenting overall findings or something like that. So it's perfectly fine to do this. People get worried about salami slicing. Salami slicing is when you have unnecessarily reduced the component to very small just to get out of various different papers. And with qualitative research, it's usually is quite hard to publish all the findings that you have got into one journal article. So it's really very, very difficult. So if you can make a sensible sort of aspect as to what you're presenting in which journal article. So that's where making an outline helps. So if you've made an outline that this is what I'm going to present here, this is what I'm going to present somewhere else. So it helps you make that distinction. Mixed method studies are also another one, because you may have findings from a survey which are kind of, you know, being able to stand alone on themselves. You may have findings from the qualitative work which can stand alone in itself, but then you may also have findings to bring those things together to see what does it mean. So as long as it's sensible, as long as the relationship between various different parts of the studies that you're doing is made it clear, it's completely fine.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Anybody else?
There's a question in chat, Parveen, about how long does it take to get published?
Okay. Well, how long does it takes? At least about 6 months to 1 year. So a very minimum would be at least 6 months. So if anyone says to you that we will publish in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it's a lie. It's just not possible. For this, you need to understand the peer review process and what happens once you've submitted your thing to a journal at times. So for instance, if you've submitted to my journal, it's going to go to the editorial assistant, who is going to look at the paperwork and make sure everything that is needed in relation to the requirements is all there. They will look at all of those kind of tick boxy things, that if there's anything which is missing, they will unsubmit and go back to you and say, well, this is not available, so you will have to kind of do that. So once you pass that stage, then it's going to come to, then they're going to look at the similarity sort of stuff. Once you pass that stage, then it's going to come to the editor, who is going to have a look at that and see if it's related to aims and objectives and scope of the journal. If it's not, it gets rejected. If it is, then it's passed on to the other editors, allocated editors, who will then find reviewers. Reviewers usually are given anything between 4 to 12 weeks to read through the articles and give us feedback. There are more than one reviewers. There are usually 2 reviewers as a minimum, who will read through your article, give feedback to the editors. The editors will then have a look at both of those reviews that they have provided, read through the manuscripts and make their own decision, and then it will come back to you with changes. You will have kind of at least about 8 to 12 weeks to make those changes and send it back to the editor again. It goes through the same process as earlier on. The only exception this time is that it's not going to get desk rejected, because it's already in the process, but it will go to the same peer reviewers again, who will read through, and if you're lucky, and if there's only one revision, and if the peer reviewer has accepted those revisions, then the editor would come back. Then it will, all of that has happened, then it will come to me as an editor. Then I will go through and read through the whole document, make sure that I'm happy with the language and how it is written and the structure and everything else. And then it will go back to, so you can see even from the process, it's not going to happen in 2 weeks time. And editors, editor-in-chief, peer reviewers, all of these people are usually volunteers, and they have their day job somewhere else. So they are academics or practitioners somewhere else. So they are doing on top of everything else that they're doing in their day job. So it's not going to happen in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time. Does that answer your question? So Miskeen, I'm happy to take a question from you.
Can you listen to me, madam?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, greetings to all of the participants, and very much thankful for your informative lecture. I have a question where actually is in connection with Mr. Gerard Brennan, that whether we put our other things, like if we are having 2 or 3 objectives, and we are putting one of the objectives for the general publication. So can we put all other objectives in limitations?
If you are presenting information if you're presenting information or the findings related to one particular objective. So let's say, for example, how Gerard was saying, if the findings relate to one theme, which is about, I don't know, let's make it up. So if I take the example of my own PhD work, which was looking at intimate partner violence. So there was one thing where I wanted to look at expectations from the family. Okay, so the whole thing was talking about intimate partner violence, and this thing was about expectations from family. So I wrote a complete separate paper on expectations from family. So then your purpose and objectives of what you're presenting, not what you've conducted. So you will write the aim of this paper is to talk about XYZ. It's not the aim of the research is. Does that make sense? Because you're reporting on the findings of the research and you're presenting that. So if you said the aim of this paper is to talk about X, Y, and Z, and the findings relate to a bigger piece of research in which is published there. So I think it depends on if you describe your objectives or not, depends on, is it relevant? How much word count you have where you're going to explain this, and all those various different factors. And if it makes you feel safe and better, maybe you do it from start and then change it as you are editing it. Okay. Zainab.
Yes, thank you, madam.
Zainab, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like when we are enrolled in PhD,
Mm-hmm.
so we are student,
Mm-hmm.
like PhD student.
Yeah.
And if we complete our PhD and
Mm-hmm.
we are like employee somewhere as employee, so is there any concession for the charges of publication or same for the enrolled student or the if he is not a student?
Okay, so there is misconception quite a lot in various, especially in the developing countries, that people think that you will only be able to publish if you are paying for it. Okay, so you don't need to choose for a paid option. There are a lot of there are a lot of journals which still publish your work, and they wouldn't charge you for what you're publishing. So if you are struggling with money, and if you can't pay for publication charges, you don't have to go for the majority of the journals are still going through the route where what you've published is behind paywalls, but they don't charge you for publishing, and there are other ways of making your findings more public. And one of this is the preprint copies. So is that what it is called, Sarah?
Preprint servers.
Preprint servers, that's the one. And what you do is that the submitted manuscript that you've submitted to a journal, you submit to these preprint servers. So your manuscript is already available, and it clearly says that it's preprint server, so people can see. And you, at the end, you say that you can replace it with the accepted version of your article, and that's an accepted practice. So you could disseminate findings from that particular, but you don't have to choose a journal which is charging you. So that's one part. The other part is there are certain journals, and most journals, they would have different requirements depending on your institution. So for instance, if you are, for example, in the UK, and if I take my example from the University of Sheffield, so they have seemed to have got an agreement with Sage publishers, and so your article get automatically open access published. Some of the journals also would have some mechanisms where they fund or reduce the amount that people need to pay depending on where you live or what the arrangements are with your organization. So there are various different options that you can pick and choose from, but you don't really have to go for only the paid option for publication. So I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you, Parveen.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm just going to read out a question that's in chat at the moment. And it says, would you have suggestions about parts of your thesis that you think are quite good analysis of the literature, but don't have a research method, almost like an opinion article or a critical commentary? Or don't you think that's adequate for PhD level?
I'm not entirely sure about if I understand the question, but what I understand is that, can you publish different parts of your thesis, or does it only have to be research? No, it doesn't have to be research. I think, so again, I will use my own example. When I did my PhD, or when I'm doing with my students, what I say is literature review. So I published a systematic review of literature for one particular country. I published 2 theoretical reviews article on the theories of abuse at that time. And then I published article from the research findings as well. So as long as they are not repeating the same thing, and you're not recycling the text, and you're not copying and pasting yourself and self-plagiarizing, you're talking about something different each time, it's perfectly fine. And you don't need to be, they don't have to be in the same journal either. So they can go to various different journals depending on, what publishes what. And that's okay. I think as long as you're clear as to what is the purpose of the article that you're publishing and what is the reader going to gain out of it, that's fine. That's not a problem. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that answered her question perfectly.
Okay. Anybody else? No? All good? Okay, so has that helped you with your queries or with questions or any objectives why you joined this session today? Okay, so Sarah has put up a survey in there. Please do fill in the survey. And if you are ever sort of not very, people are doing this, just to give some feedback. If sometimes you're never sure that if I write, does this abstract or does this paper fit with this particular journal? Shall I write for that or not? It's okay to contact editors and write to them, and they're usually very helpful, and they have a look at that and they can tell you does that suit their journal, or but whatever they're saying is not a guarantee of publication. What they're saying is that, well, yes, it looks relevant, so why don't you submit, and we will have to see how that goes. So you can ask a journal editor and they'll be able to answer the question, and you can see if that helps you. You can also sort of like journal finders and all those sorts of things will help you find appropriate journal for your for your proposed article. But the point is that if you have got a query, there's no need to just sit there and keep thinking. You can just write an email to somebody and ask them. However, do your homework. A lot of time what people do is they don't do their homework, and what they would like somebody else to do their the homework for them, and therefore make a suggestion that people are going to do it. No, the idea is that go through the email, the journals, see what is relevant, and then if you're not clear about something, it's okay to just write to them and ask, well, I'm not entirely sure about this, can you please tell me that? Because if you haven't done your homework and you've just written an email, people would know that you haven't done your homework. So therefore, the information that you usually would get, or why don't you go to this page, read through this information and see what's best for you. But it's okay to ask people, but make sure that you've done your homework too. Any other question? So if you don't have a question, can you please tell us how was it for you? Did that meet your expectations? My God, nobody wants to talk.
There are a few bits appearing in chat.
Yeah. Please, please, please do fill us the evaluation form. It will only take a few minutes of your time, and it's very, very valuable to us. Are there any topics that you think you or anybody else in your position would find it helpful? If you have any suggestions, please do let us know about that as well. Okay, so thank you,
What you were saying.
Sorry?
I said, I think everyone was absorbing what you were saying. You must have answered everybody's questions.
Sarah, have I missed anything? Is there anything else that you would like to add, or?
Not really, only for the inevitable plug for the rest of our sessions, which I've put the link further up chat for the sessions that are coming across the rest of the year. So our next one is going to be in detail looking at choosing a journal for publication, looking at kind of models of publishing, and also using, I'm going to give a few demonstrations of the journal matching products that you can get. The ones that are linked to publishers tend to push you towards their publishing house. Yeah. There are several independent ones, so I'm going to demonstrate some of the independent products. As Parveen says, it's very easy to use, but I'll give some examples, and we can look at some publishing author guidelines linked to journals that we'll find.
And you've raised a very important point, because if you go through like Elsevier, BMC, and all of these publishers have the journal finder, but they usually would suggest their own journals. So it's important to kind of, and that's why it's important that use the articles that you've read, see where those journals are published, and perhaps come and attend Sarah's session where we are going to talk about that aspect, that how do you find a generic list which is not tied to one particular company and just gives you a little bit more information. And usually once you've done this thing 3-4 times, then you get used to of it, and then you don't really need journal finders or some of the other aspects, and you can still kind of look for various different you can find your way around and look for, you know, what journal you're looking for. But these are very good starters initially. Okay, one of the other thing anyone hasn't really asked me, but I'm just going to say, so one of the things which people are, if you're writing thesis, should your supervisors be co-authors? It would be really useful, and the answer is yes, if it's possible. Now, when you're writing dissertation, especially at bachelor's and master's level, usually bachelor's level, undergraduate level, they do engage with teachers. Master's level, sometimes students don't necessarily engage with their supervisor that much and may have written the whole thing by themselves. So they may or may not feel that, you know, somebody else needs to be included into it. If they have contributed enough to your study by providing you feedback, by providing you supervision, by shaping the information, they may not have gone out and collected data for you, but they may have given you enough sort of steer and guidance to shape your thesis. And I think it's useful to have them in there and just write it with them. If you write with somebody, I think it makes it easier for you to write your thesis, and it just helps you develop further working relationships with people. And it also helps you to see if you like those people or not, and can you continue working with them. So that's one of the questions that many people ask. So I just thought to give answer. But if you think that they are not, if they would not participate, or if you ask them and they don't want to do it, and you just want to do it by yourself, or you want to involve somebody else, that is fine too. So article published in a journal are not they're not your thesis, they're separate products. So if you're working with somebody else for the journal article, it's fine too. Another question is, who should be the first author? If, for example, if a student and supervisor, well, it's whoever has written the article. Okay, so whoever has contributed to the writing of the article more, that's the person who is going to be the first author. Or you can, the other thing is, it's better to agree and decide among yourself initially when you're writing a manuscript, and to go with that. But all of that discussion is maybe for some other time. But I hope today's discussion was useful for all of you. If you have any questions, please do feel free to write, and I'll try my best to answer those questions. Okay, thank you everybody, have a good day, and I'll stop recording.